Welcome to Speaking in Hues. I'm Nsofwa Chanda.
And I'm Taylor Nichols.
And thank you all for tuning in to our video podcast. We had promised this a couple months ago, and we are here in the flesh. Not live, but in the flesh. There was like 5 different takes for that. But we're here, and we're hoping that this is something that our viewers like. And we're going to also make sure that you all know that we are still going to have the audio version of our podcast, so you can either watch us or listen. So today we're going to be talking about how far is too far. That is the topic for our discussion today. And the reason it came about was, what were we talking about?
There are multiple. Well, one, we're recording this on Halloween, so happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween.
Ghouls. And we were talking about Halloween costumes last episode, because remember, I closed out last episode and I was like, and I better not see any Diddy and Baby Oil costumes.
Right.
And I saw both of them.
Of course you did. I knew that was happening.
Yeah. I didn't think it was going to be blackface, but here we are.
Here we are.
And then shortly after that episode, we're not going to get too deep into politics, because this will be up after Election Day on Tuesday. But we saw the comedian Kill Tony at Madison Square Garden give a very interesting, would you call it a speech? I don't really know what you would call that.
Random words
where he
strung
did
together.
Kind of getting at everybody, Puerto Ricans, Black people, Jewish people.
He's a comedian though, right?
Allegedly.
Okay.
Yes. I can't remember his last name, but I know he goes by Kill Tony, because I have seen a few of his sketches and stuff like that.
Okay.
That was very offensive, to the point where multiple celebrities have come out and rescinded their endorsements of the former president Donald Trump because of the comments made at Madison Square Garden last week. So the topic, how far is too far, it's pretty topical, considering it's Halloween, and then also what happened last week.
We were actually having this conversation in a group that I was in a few days ago. A student asked me, and again, we're not going to get too deep into politics, but we were just kind of talking about the election and the energy around it and the anxiety that people have, things like that. And a student asked me, so has it always been this way? Mind you, they were young voters. You know, I think this might be their first election that they're voting in. And so, of course, me, having seen multiple elections, had to recount the times where I didn't think that the elections were as bad as this. I think the elections have gotten worse. Just the vitriol, just the way that the limits that they can cross. I think this is on brand what we're talking about. The limits that people can cross that nobody blinks an eye at anymore. And so I was trying to explain to them, like, yeah, back in the day, politics were politics. People knew like there were certain things that they couldn't say, or they could literally lose their careers over saying a certain thing.
Or even being associated with a certain thing. It didn't even have to be things that they said.
Right. Being associated with it. They try to take really cautious steps in terms of, saying the wrong thing or being affiliated with the wrong thing. But now, it's just, I don't know. And so the student was basically asking me, like, well, one of the students asked, when did it get this bad and why? So we try to like peel it back to say, well, I think it kind of changed around here. And there's lots of theories about like when it got bad and how it got bad. But we're here now, right? We're in a space where I don't think we really know how far is too far.
Yeah. And how far is too far can be very subjective when it comes to like comedy, but also like when it comes to like media. So we're going to talk a little bit more about like media's impact on how we consume information too.
So let's think about comedy, right? So when we were thinking about this episode and trying to think of the areas where we think people have gone too far, or maybe it's acceptable to go too far, and maybe it's not considered too far, we were thinking about comedy as one area. We were thinking about education as another area. What was the other one?
Media. We're talking about like TMZ. And
media. Yeah. So let's start with comedy, right? So I love a good comedian, right? I do think that there are some boundaries. One of the things I was telling Taylor was that I was on Facebook or whatever it was, looking at my reels, and there was this white guy who, young, I can't remember his name, but he was kind of doing that, what do you call it when you engage with the audience and you're just like riffing off of the people in the audience? I don't know what you call that, but that's what he was doing.
Crowd work.
Sure. Yeah, crowd work. Now, I started to clutch my little pearls because I thought this was too far, right? So there was a woman on the front row, and she had this little scarf over her head, like she was a cancer patient. So she was. So he was, what's the scarf for? She was like, I'm a cancer patient. He asked her what stage. She said stage 4. then he starts asking her questions about like, does she want to be cremated? Does she want like a funeral? I mean, just a lot of questions. And he was making jokes about death with this woman who was facing death. And I just thought it was so cringy. Like, I thought it was too far. I thought it was too much. But, you know, she played along. And then the daughter, a younger person, was like kind of hitting on him at the same time that he was joking about the mom. And I was like, all this feels wrong. Like,
first of all
this feels super wrong.
Also, time and place, lady.
Yes. So there was another segment where she was like, "Oh, I was on this stage. They were in London, and she was like, I was on this stage, you know, when I was 15 years old, and I got on stage with the performers." And he's like, "Oh, you got to come on stage again." So he gets security to come. She didn't say she wanted to be on stage. She gets security to come, take her on stage, and then he was like, "Oh yeah, just straight through, right through the door into the furnace." And it was a joke about her demise. I was like, I don't like it. Yeah. I think it was too much. What do you think? You think it's too much?
I would be like the whole time. No, I'm sorry. Like, there's a time and a place for that. Like, this man is talking about your mother's death, and you're flirting with him.
She was.
Lady, I love comedy, and I like that comedy is like edgy. Like the whole point of it's supposed to like, you know, like push.
Yeah, it's supposed to push some boundaries.
But there are lines. And I think, and I also think we're in a place right now which really angers me. And it's like, I grew up watching comedy and like stand up, like kings of comedy, like with my dad, my family, and stuff like that. Like Bernie Mac, Steve Harvey, Cedric the Entertainer, like a bunch, you know, like I love Richard Pryor and stuff like that. And to me, I think the beautiful thing about comedy is that like pop culture, it evolves over time. And I watch these one comedians, Deezus and Mero. They're no longer a pair anymore. They like kind of broke up. But they had this really cool interview where they talked about how there are jokes that they used to do. And they were like, there's jokes that we used to do like years ago that we don't do anymore because they are offensive. Mm-hmm. And they're like, if you can't grow with the times, then like how good of a comedian like are you actually? And like the example that I use, which this is not me saying that blackface is good. It's very bad, always has been bad. But there was a time in comedy where that was very normalized, right? Mm-hmm. Now if you do blackface in 2024, what are you doing? Yeah. One. But I get kind of frustrated when I see like famous comedians or comedians that were once super famous come out and be like, I can't say what I want anymore because everyone's so sensitive. And it's like, I think you just are not evolving, you know? Like,
well, I mean, I agree with you. I feel like, you know, when you know better, you do better.
Exactly.
Right? So if you know that there's a particular group that you want to chastise or to ridicule, but it's hurtful, then yeah. But then also, it's not even just about people, right? It's about events as well, right? It's like, how soon is too soon to make a funny about a thing, right? Make a funny about a thing. And I don't know what that timeline is, but at some point, it's too soon and it's too far at the same time. Like, we were talking about 9/11 jokes.
Yeah, right? Like how younger people are more likely to laugh and make jokes about 9/11 than like people who were like...
Yeah. And we're alive and saw the towers and all that stuff, right? So I don't know who sets the bar for when things are inappropriate, what the timeline is between being, okay, it's acceptably funny that you do it now at this point versus it's horribly wrong for you to even make a joke about that right now. Like, I know I've heard people make jokes about, like, as horrible as it sounds saying it on this space, but like about the Holocaust, right? I've heard people say things. I think it's still horrible, but others think it's funny. I don't know who's the hall monitor on whether it's funny or not. No, I'm joking. But I think also another layer to this is like who's saying the joke as well.
And also, are we punching up or punching down?
Yeah.
I think it's so much easier to punch down than it is to punch up. And I think that's why so many comedians nowadays, it's kind of like they're not putting in a whole lot of work because they're going for shock value. When Kill Tony was called Puerto Rico a floating piece of trash, like whatever. To me, that wasn't funny. And then you have people be like, well, it's out of context. And like, the context was wild. But also, it's like, well, what if he performed that in a comedy club? I'm like, so, I don't really think it's that funny. I think a lot of comedians are going for shock value, knowing what'll go viral, what'll, like, get them clicks and views and stuff like that, that we're kind of, like, not being funny anymore. We're not taking the fun part of comedy, of, like, writing jokes and, like, how poetic it can be and how like fun. I don't know. It just feels like a lot of comedians are going for shock value over content and being funny.
Yeah, and I also feel like comedians were more studiers of their craft. For example,
Dave Chappelle.
Dave Chappelle, Chris Rock, like him or not like him, Cat Williams. I think Cat Williams,
unfortunately, is so funny.
He is. But he's brilliant. Like he's literally brilliant. But I do think like sometimes comedians just go for the low hanging fruit, and it's like I can get them with this, and I just keep it pushing.
Yeah.
You know.
And I think you bring up a really good point though. Like Dave Chappelle, prior to his Netflix specials that he keeps getting talking about trans people, like constantly, which is why we're like, oh, cancel culture. I'm like, this man will not stop getting Netflix deals. He'll continue to talk about trans people. It's very odd to me, but he was an amazing storyteller, not just with his comedy, but also with his TV show. Like, the Chappelle Show was so good. And he was a brilliant writer. And, like, his jokes, you know, he was making, like, KKK jokes, and we were geeking. Like,
true.
Like, you know?
True.
And that,
they
to
were
me,
hilarious.
And I still think a lot of his stuff holds up today. Remember when he had a whole segment about Diddy? And, like, when Diddy had a show called Making the Band, like, that was so funny. Yeah. It still is very funny.
That.
Yeah.
I remember that.
D-Lon, you know, he was, like, making them go get cookies around the city. You know, like, that's hilarious.
Yeah.
But I think because he's such a good storyteller, it's, like, now sometimes when I take in some of his, like, current stuff, I'm like, this is not hitting. Like, this just feels weird.
Like, even, like, I would even say, like, Kevin Hart. Right? Like, I know, because I've heard people talk about these interviews, like, they study the craft of comedy, right? Like, there's a method to it, there's a rhythm to it, there's timing, there's all these things that, you know, go into, like, a really good show and a really good performance. And, like I said, I just don't think people are doing that now. And, again, I don't watch a lot of comedians that I don't personally already like. So there's that. So I can't 100% say what they're doing or not doing. But when I think about, like, the reels that I see. So,
I'm not even making fun of you for watching reels. It's just so funny.
The other thing too, like I was watching this comedian the other day, and I cringed a little bit. Okay, it was this woman, and she's a black woman, and she was talking about her daughter, and she was saying that she don't even really know how to talk to her daughter anymore. She's like, you know, everything she says is like, yeah, and you know, it was all this, you know, theatrics or whatever. So she's like, the only way I can talk to her is to talk to her like that, in response to what she's saying, you know, like, you know, just being very theatrical. And at the end of the skit, she was saying that she couldn't go to this party, and the girl was like, why can't I go to the party? She's like, well, you don't know any details about the party, blah, blah, blah. And the girl's upset, and she's like, I hate you, to her mother, right? And the mother was like, I'm glad you said that, because I hate you too, B. And I was like, to your daughter? I know it's supposed to be, like, funny, but like I kind of cringed a little bit. Like I would never tell my child that, you know, even like in a skit, like even if I didn't say that for real and it was fake skit and I was just making it up, like if my daughter saw that, I still feel terrible. I think that's too far. I thought it was funny, but I do think it was too far.
Yeah. It's funny. I think like too far. It kind of goes back to our conversation last week. It's like if too far is too far when it feels like super personal. Sometimes I feel like.
Yeah.
But then
are you saying you think it's only too far? Not collectively we understand it to be too far, but it depends on the person and the connection to the topic.
Yeah. Like sometimes I have a hard time when people talk about certain things. I'm like ooh, but I know it's because it's personal to me. Yeah. But then I think about like the Puerto Rico joke, even though that's not personal.
It's too far.
It just felt bad. It felt, I don't know. And I think that's the whole point of the conversation today is like, there is no marker of like what is too far, but it's also important as humans for us to read the room, know who your audience is.
That's what I think is like missing these days. I don't think people read the room like they used to. I think people are oblivious to just, you know, where people are in history, kind of like what their experiences have been, where they are like politically. Like I think a lot of times people just don't care and they just don't like have that perception anymore. Like they don't necessarily like think outside of themselves as much as they used to. Yeah. And the last thing I'll say about comedy too is it also depends on who is saying it, right? So, you know, like we've said this before, and this is not news to anybody, but like when we talk about sensitive topics within our own culture, you know, it's more accepted to be funny if it's meant to be that way versus if someone outside of our culture and our identities say something that is sensitive or it's just like, you know, off the mark, then They could say the exact same thing, and the response would be completely different.
Exactly. I think it kind of goes to your point of like, that's what's missing from it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, oftentimes it's very funny when Black people make jokes about the Black common experience versus when Kill Tony is like, oh, that guy's like, over there eating watermelon. It's like, all right, brother. Like, oh, brother, we like, you know, another one, you know? The audience and also your own positionality.
Yeah.
And I think that's what makes comedy so good sometimes, where it's having a conversation about Dave Chappelle, like, probably a few years ago, where it was like, oh, I can't make jokes about trans people. And it's like, it's not that. But there are trans comedians that are really, really funny, that their jokes are just better. Like, it be coming from them and their experience and, like, how they move throughout the world. That, to me, is more interesting than someone a cis person making jokes about trans, you know, like.
Yeah, and I think sometimes, too, when it falls too far into a stereotype, that it just feels icky. Like, the whole watermelon thing, it's like
get another one.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah. I mean, that's just this old trope that people have been using for years. And I will say that, and I don't know if I've told this story before, but
I love watermelon though.
Well, there was one time. Well, I think I may have said this on one episode or another, but like there was for a long time that I wouldn't send my daughter to school with watermelon because she went to like this private school. It had mostly white people there, and I was like, I don't know. I don't like it.
No, my mom hates when I'm around white people when I order chicken. She's like, "What are you doing?"
Yes,
and I'm like, "Okay, like." It's wing Wednesday. Let me lock in. Lock in. But I get that.
But there's also part of me that's like very resistant to it. Like, I'm going to send her with watermelon and chicken just because I'm not going to let you dictate to me what I can send my child with because some stereotypes that's not even true. So I think when people make that about, like, that's all we are. And again, it is a stereotype, but it doesn't mean that we, as Black people, can never touch these foods only in private. To me, that feels restrictive. That feels like
it feels a little bit like respectability politics. Yeah. No. Have you ever like looked at the old like cartoons like back in the day how racist those used to be?
Yeah.
Like I will sometimes like will play them on YouTube. I'm like, wow, this was so. It's like you have like these Black figures that don't look like Black people at all, and like, like it's so racist, and I'm like, whoa, this is. But literally.
But that goes back to what you were saying about
at one time that was acceptable to put on TV.
Right,
you could not do that now.
You better not. That's what I'm saying too. People just saying whatever they want to say because people aren't pushing back as consistently as they should. Like, we know that image of the black face and the red lips and the watermelon is unacceptable. Like, we know that.
I didn't even say the red lips, but I know exactly what you mean.
But yes, we know, and the big eyes, and like, all that's unacceptable. But I think, like, because we see blackface during comedy during Halloween now, right?
Like clockwork.
Like, we see it because we know it's happening. We can almost set our clocks to it. We know that's happening. We know the offensive costumes are going to happen. We know that we have some political candidates that say whatever the hell they want to say, and it's just like we're inching back to this level of everything's fair game. You can say whatever you want.
And I think too, like, we're also seeing a time in politics, and I'm not going to get too political here, even though I could do it, of like we talk about censorship and free speech and like Twitter. I mean, X, not formerly known as Twitter, but these things of like, oh, it's free speech, First Amendment, I can say whatever I want, but people are confusing what I can say whatever I want with I can say whatever I want sans consequences. And so it's like people get upset, well, like, well, I can't say what I want. I'm like, no, you can. What you can say can offend people, and you could have consequences. And I think people think of that of like, well, I'm getting canceled. I'm like, no, those are just consequences to your actions, right? And I think it's a good segue into talking about like media and like how we have too much access to people. I will arguably say I've seen entirely too many things against my will on social media, but then also just in news, I guess. Like, and I love talking crap about podcasts, even though we clearly have one. But at Best Buy, I needed to get a lock on those microphones in the back. Because before, how we would consume a lot of, like, content was, like, kind of solely through the news, through, like, fact-checking, through people who are qualified journalists. And then now we're in a time where we're seeing people want to prosecute journalists. And also, anyone has access to a mic now and can say whatever they want. And that's how we get so much mis- and disinformation out there. And it's not really actually accurate.
Yeah.
How far is too far when it comes to the media consumption that you're consuming, that you might just be casually scrolling. This never used to happen prior to social media, where you would just casually scrolling something on your phone and seeing something so violent, like against your will, right? And I was talking about like TMZ and like Liam Payne, the passing of the former One Direction star, where it's like I'm casually scrolling, I'm like, why do I see a dead body on my timeline, you know? And it makes us desensitized, right? Like, especially when it comes to police brutality.
Oh, yes.
And
the things that we've seen in the last few years about like the beatings and it's a lot.
I'm not totally against censorship of certain things. Like, I know the passing of Emmett Till and like seeing that obviously was a catalyst to the civil rights movement. Yeah. But having so much access to this is re-traumatizing for a lot of people.
It is.
And I think oftentimes, like, oh, well, people need to see it. I'm like, we've seen it 1,000 times. How far have we gotten on the police brutality thing?
Yeah, you know? I don't know. I'm a little stuck on that one because, especially with police brutality, like, I'm like, show us what they did. Like, I know it's hard to see, but we need to know, like, how far they went, right? And I don't think we need to see it every day for 6 months, you know what I mean? Yeah. Like, replaying it and things like that. Sometimes we need to know, like, what it was exactly that they did. And, you know, with, like, Rodney King, right? Like, to me, I think that showed a lot. And we didn't used to get this information, as you know. I mean, things would happen. People would be, you know, disposed of. I mean, people would be beaten and shot and all that. We just heard their story, their side of it. But I agree. It's traumatizing. Like, George Floyd traumatized me bad. Right? And after one time I was like, okay, I don't need to see it anymore. But like, I know that there's other folks that somehow just being able to see the visual image of it kind of keeps the fire burning.
Because I think of like public lynchings back in the day. You ever see those photos of like a literally dead body and you see like a bunch of like white people like, you know, and then they go home and eat dinner afterwards. And like how normal that type of stuff was. And it makes me think, obviously it's so important, and like I did an amazing job with the lynching campaign back in the day of like showing the numbers and showing like how often this happens. But my fear is like we see it so much that it's like that's just normal now. And we also don't have to do anything about it because it's so normal. You know, like
where do we draw the line there? Like exposure, so there's education around like what's actually happening versus traumatization over like seeing it so much. You know, I don't know. I don't know.
I just think back to like, you know, Trayvon Martin's like 2013, 2014. That's almost a little bit over 10 years ago. Right. How far have we gotten in the strive for better policing?
I don't know.
And it's like we're constantly exposed to it. It's like, but how far are we getting when it comes to making actual change? Anyway, I mean, obviously, police brutality is a super hard topic to really like dive into. But I'm thinking even like with Kobe Bryant's death, right?
Oh my gosh,
like, and oftentimes TMZ. I'm a TMZ hater. Sorry, I'm not afraid to say that out loud. Just because I think media's also gotten to a place where everyone's wants to be the first and not the most accurate. And like oftentimes people are finding out that their relatives have passed through TMZ.
Yeah, and that's exactly what happened with Kobe Bryant. Like, oh, I have another example. Okay, so last episode we were talking about Chris Brown.
Here we go.
Since then, I watched his documentary. I think it came out in 2015.
Was it on Reels?
17? No, it wasn't on Reels. But I did watch it, and it was called Welcome to My World, right? I was telling Taylor, I like Chris Brown. Okay, I like him. So anyway, in this
I love that you have to like preface that.
In this documentary he had about his life, he was talking about how he was with Karrueche Tran, which was his girlfriend at the time, and there was a breakup between him and Karrueche, and during that time his first daughter was conceived, right? But he got back with Karrueche. So he didn't know this girl, the baby girl, was alive or that she was even his. So she gets it about 9 months, and he's like, hey, this person's mine. So his lawyer calls him, and it's like, you know, that TMZ is getting ready to release this in 30 minutes, right? And he was like, I'm not even near my girl. I need to contact Karrueche and let her know. But by the time he could get in touch with her, his girlfriend, Karrueche Tran, was watching it on TV, or whatever TMZ was releasing it on, and he didn't even have time to like explain himself, and she broke up with him like immediately, right? Not to say that she wouldn't have done that anyway, but like I think the media just has this, like what you were saying, like they just don't care about your life. They don't care if it's too far, and in that instance, I don't know. I just feel like, give him the courtesy of just like breaking the news to his loved one before you're just out there.
No.
You know?
There's like this series called like The Dark Side of the 2000s on Hulu, and they talk about TMZ and like what like media blogs used to be like Perez Hilton. I even like brought this up. I like brought Perez Hilton up in class the other day. Like, who is that? And they're like, you mean Paris Hilton? I was like, don't correct me.
Oh my gosh.
No.
No.
I was actually sit down. But
you have to get schooled.
I mean, we talk about this all the time. But I was like, these blogs used to be ruthless the way that they talked about like young women who were like maybe 18, 19 years old. But it was like a niche part of the internet. Like my mom at the time was not paying attention to Perez Hilton or like, because TMZ started off as a blog, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, it was like nothing. It was like just a little.
Now TMZ is how I find out.
I see
like,
TMZ on everything,
and it's not because I subscribe, but like I'll get like it'll be breaking news TMZ, and it's the most devastating thing you've ever read, and like what? like that's not normal, you know? And it's like. And like that's I don't know, and I think sometimes we feel entitled to celebrities' lives because they're like, oh, you're famous. If you didn't want these things to happen, but you shouldn't be famous. And I'm like, no, they still are people. You know,
they're
like
still people, and that's another part of like this how far is too far conversation when it does come to celebrities, right? Because they are people, exposing things, private things about their lives. They're just kind of going through all these lengths to get access to them, and I think. Honestly, a lot. And I think about Princess Diana and all this other stuff. I think the whole thing,
Queen.
I think the whole media needs to be revamped in terms of like their core understanding of what is acceptable in terms of practice and in terms of accumulating information. Like I think there needs to be some standards. There doesn't seem to be any standards out there. Like you do whatever you want. You can chase people. You can like spy on them. You can use drones. You can interrupt their weddings. You can do all this stuff, and all of it feels too far to me.
Yeah.
Quite honestly.
And then you have TMZ paying people allegedly, for the record, who are within hospitals when like famous people are like, in there, or like, I don't know. It just like feels so. And paparazzi has always been a thing, but
paparazzi, yeah.
But it just feels like dehumanizing, and it feels like entirely, there used to be jokes about Kanye running after the paparazzi, like pictures of him and him attacking them. Like, I honestly kind of get it. Like,
it would drive you stark crazy, I think.
And it would make me not want to be famous. I would never want to be famous. That's why I don't want to be on camera right now. I'm joking.
She's doing great, though. The other piece I was thinking about, too, was education. And education is another thing I think we have to, like, really put the microscope on in terms of how we educate, when we educate, and what's being said. Now, I come from a school of thought that says as long as it's true, you should be able to know about it, right? You should be aware of the world that you're living in, the history that's being made every day, as long as it's accurate, right? However, there are some certain subjects where it's not about what the topic is, it's like when you're exposed to it. So for example, we talked about like sex education. There's been a ton of like debate about like who should be teaching kids about sex, when they should learn about it.
Should it be in their curriculum or at home?
Should it be at home? Should it be in the curriculum? Should it be parents? Should it be peers? Like
my mom was not telling me about that. My mom was not telling me about that.
My aunt told me a little bit about like the birds and the bees,
but my mom, I remember one time.
But we didn't have sex education either, so
I barely had. I had period education barely. They're like, here are these tampons and pads. You do, whatever.
Go forth and prosper.
Literally, I remember like my mom was not gonna tell me about. I think I one time asked her like, oh, like where do babies come from? She's like, sex. People have sex.
That's what she said.
Pretty sure. She's like, yeah. Like she just was not gonna. Like,
not gonna break it down or anything.
No.
It's uncomfortable, I think, for some people. I mean, because here's your baby talking about like wanting to
how
know.
They got here. When I talk to my students about it, they have very, very huge variety in what type of education they got. I think when I was in school, it was like don't have sex. It kind of like that Mean Girls meme was like don't have sex, you'll get pregnant or die. Like one of those things. But we're seeing. I think the huge issue with sex education in the United States is there are some kids who have a little bit, and there are some kids who just have none. And then they come to college with other kids who have varying levels of like knowledge.
When do we educate? Because otherwise, that's how you get like people who are very ignorant and very uninformed going out into the world, saying horrible things, not reading the room, making comedy jokes that don't make sense, that are hurtful.
Yeah. And we even brought this up when we were talking about like how young is too young to teach about racism, right? Especially when kids experience racism, right? So it's like, well, talking about like, oh, my kid shouldn't learn about this just yet, but it's like Tommy is experiencing it, so how come he like is experiencing it, doesn't get to learn about it, nor does his peers, right? Like, and so I think it's important to think about what content we're like limiting when it comes to not just children, but like that's why we're seeing all over the United States people coming hard down on not even just K through 12, but also higher education, like what's being taught in those classes.
I think there is a how far is too far and how far is not far enough when it comes to education. One thing we'd also said about education too was like teaching about current events and things that have happened, when to be able to kind of teach about those without being biased or whatever, like just being able to kind of say, here's the factual things that happened in an event that was pretty polarizing. I guess I would urge our audience members too to just kind of think about it for themselves. Like we said this earlier at the top of the episode, like there's no chart that tells us, that we can follow to say, well, once you reach this level of audacity or whatever, you've maxed out your limit of like it being okay.
I think a good takeaway is just being cautious of like what you are consuming too.
Yeah.
Like, and also having a judgmental eye. Be like, okay, like what is this source? Like, where is it coming from? Who is this person? I'm not saying that like comedy is bad. I love comedy, and I consider myself the court jester at times. But also just like reading your room and understanding your own positionality when it comes to certain things. Like, I don't know.
And why is this important though? That's the other thing that I think we need to ask ourselves. Like conversations like this, like why do we have them, and what we want people to do with them? Maybe there's some point where you're like, oh, I hadn't thought about it that way. Like what are we suggesting is the purpose of having these kinds of introspective conversations,
I think it's good to I think it's important to check ourselves and check our people within our communities, like, I don't know. I think we're so afraid of having conversations that like, hey, like what you said was kind of like hurtful, and like not being able to defense immediately, like, I don't know. I think we need to sometimes take a step back and be like how it's, impact over intent.
I agree with that. Yeah. And I guess I think about it more big picture too. Like I would love it if we were, and I know this is a little unrealistic to say we live in a world where nobody hurts each other, right? Everybody knows all the rules. It'd be nice. But like, I would love to have these conversations lead into us scaling back on some of the ways in which we've allowed people, things like comedy and education and the media, to just really hurt people. Like, we're okay with it because it's entertainment. Sometimes it's entertainment. Sometimes you feel like, oh, they're making a good point, or, oh, it's funny, but not really thinking about like the harm that's done. I would love for us to just kind of use conversations like this to just remind us that there's other humans in the room, and by the room I mean the world, and like maybe take stock in like how we're just kind of interacting with each other. Like I just feel like we're going so far off the deep end with not really caring if what we say or what we do is hurtful or too far. I want us to scale it back a little bit if we can. That's my thought. Well, thank you for joining us, Speaking in Cues. Be sure to listen to our audio podcast on Spotcast and any other platforms that offer your favorite podcast shows.